Network security, Windows Firewall. In this nugget, we talk about Windows Firewall. And of course, the purpose of a firewall, like any good firewall, is to block especially inbound traffic so that we can make sure that no connection attempts are actually made. Much like my dating life back in college, blocked at every attempt. But of course, we do have to sometimes allow exceptions to this as well. For example, if someone is trying to access a share on your computer, but you've blocked all connection attempts through the Windows Firewall, they'll never be able to access that share. It could be a shared folder, could be a shared printer, or it could be some other kind of thing, like a network game or something like this. So sometimes you do have to allow exceptions. Now, there are 3 interfaces to Windows Firewall, including Windows Control Panel. In Windows Control Panel, they are called exceptions. Later on, when you look at certain other things, certain other interfaces, they're going to be called allow rules instead. So these are really the same thing, just they're called different things in different interfaces. Again, Control Panel calls these exceptions. Then the other place that we can access the firewall settings through is going to be Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, and also through a Group Policy object. So then, how do we actually access Windows Firewall to manipulate it and configure it? A couple of different ways of getting there. What I often do is I just right-click on my connection little icon in the tray area here, choose Network and Sharing Center, and then I choose a firewall link from there, or probably the more textbook way to go would be to go through Control Panel, then to go up here to Network and Internet, and then you could go down here to Windows Firewall, or you could kind of shortcut to one of these other settings that you see through here. And then we can see again here, as I mentioned in a previous nugget, that my firewall is actually turned off now because I use another third-party firewall. But I'm going to go ahead and change the settings here. Notice the shield icon, so it's going to require user account control. But I'll change the settings here and continue, and then I'm going to allow Windows Firewall to be turned on. Once that's been turned on, I'm then going to be blocking all incoming connections except for anything that I've got listed on the exceptions tab, which we'll come to in a moment. But regardless, even if I have exceptions, if I'm in an emergency where there's a fast-moving worm or a virus on my network that's gotten loose somehow, then I could just block all incoming connections. And that would not prevent people from doing normal things such as browsing the internet, checking their email, things like that, because on their side of things, if they initiate a connection to an external host, such as a website, then that website is allowed to respond to the client. But unsolicited attempts to connect to this computer will, of course, be blocked in all cases. Now let's go ahead and take a look now. I'm going to clear that. Take a look now here at the exceptions. This is going to be where I want to allow unsolicited connections to my computer, and some of these are kind of there by default. One of them is there also as a result of a group policy object. But you see a number of different options that we have available to us, and if I had a specific application that I had here that I wanted to allow, then I could do that here as well. I think there was one I was looking for here. I guess it's not in there. I'll go down here. Maybe if I had a personal website that I was hosting on this individual computer and I installed IIS, then I could allow HTTP access to it. Not recommended. That's not a very secure way of working. Normally, you really have to go through a lot of other security precautions if you're going to do that to prevent yourself from being exploited, but I could allow it, is what I'm trying to say there. Then the other thing I could do is, if I had additional applications that I wanted, there's some here that I just wanted to point out to you. This one is remote administration. I cannot deselect that. Again, that's because that's configured through a group policy object. We're going to look at that shortly here. And then there's also remote administration. Now, this is useful, for example, if I used Computer Management Console or some other kind of a console, then I would be able to make a remote connection to this computer and fully administer it as if I were seated locally at this machine. Okay, so that's a very useful item to have. Then there's also remote assistance or remote desktop. This allows me over port 3389 to connect to a remote computer, and you've seen me do that in previous nuggets here in this very series where I've made a remote desktop connection to those systems. In this case, if I select that and then click OK here with the Windows Firewall turned on, then remotely I could make a connection to this Vista computer and pretty much work with it as if I were seated at it locally. Now, not everything is included in this. There's probably applications that I don't see listed in here that I can really access. By the way, as I select these items, I might think to myself, I wonder what port that's on, and I wonder if it shows me here. Well, if you click on Properties, it gives you a whole lot of nothing. It's almost as if they didn't have they should just take away the Properties button, because it almost does nothing for you. All it really does is give you a rudimentary description, which we really already knew anyway. But I'm going to show you how you can get into more detail with that in a little while here. But if I wanted to add additional programs, I can click Add Program down here, and I might have a critical business network application that I need to do, chess titans, for example, something like that, then I can click OK. And also, I can also change the scope. So, for example, maybe I really want, people in my company during their lunch break, I want to allow them to play chess titans over the network with one another. Well, I could change the scope, and I could say only my network subnet. That way I don't have them playing the game with people out there on the internet who might have figured out a way to exploit the game and then to be able to sneak in some kind of a virus or worm or something. So I could say, only my subnet only here. Or with a custom list, I could just enter in a given IP address or something like that. Okay, so very, very handy method for being able to work with applications that need access through the firewall. And then finally, this advanced tab about what looks like, boy, there's got to be about 1 billion options back there, a bunch of checkboxes and radio buttons and really cool drop-down lists and stuff like that. Guess what? There's hardly anything here. I don't know why they call this advanced. There's really not that much to it. Really, this just simply says, which network connections am I going to apply these firewall settings to? So and by default, they're all going to be selected, and that's fine with me. So in fact, this is really the only live connection I have. These other two are actually VMware connections, and they don't really matter that much to me. Now, you may be familiar with previous versions of firewalls or other third-party products where you could allow ping packets through. Well, here, we don't see, even in the advanced or any of the other settings here, where we can allow ping packets to come through. Well, that's an ICMP setting. There's also logging settings. There's a README file down there or a help file about it, but I'm going to show you that in a little while here anyway, so I'm just going to bypass that for the time being. So that's pretty much all there is to it. Now you see that I've turned on the firewall. My current network is a public network, but we need to talk about that too, and I need to do briefly tangent about that because this has significant impact in how the firewall works. And for that, let's go ahead and take a look here at your network location awareness settings. And this, I got to say, is probably one of the most confusing things that Microsoft has done because they changed the terms on us here. This really relates to another item. Let me see if I can get to that item right here. This relates to this screenshot. When you make a new connection to a network, it's going to pop up something like this, and it's going to ask you to set the network location. Based upon what you choose, it's going to determine what kind of firewall settings are going to apply to you and whether or not people are able to do things like browse shares on your computer. So, for example, if you choose a public location, then discovery of other computers and devices is limited, outside, and no one's going to be able, didn't really say it here specifically, but it also prevents people from being able to browse shares on your computer, whether there's shared folders or shared printers or something like this. And then, of course, there's work and home, which basically are almost exactly the same. In fact, they are. I don't know why they made those separate, except that they just had to somewhat comply to the human perception that they got to choose one thing or the other. If they're in the office, they'll choose that one. If they're at home, of course, they'll choose that one. Well, when you choose one of those items, any one of those three, it correlates to these things. If you choose the public location, of course, that's going to be public. Okay? If you choose the private location, guess what that's going to be? Home. Now, you might be thinking if you choose the work location, that's going to be domain, right? Wrong. If you choose work, it's going to actually also be private. Okay, so work, W-O-R-K, I think I can spell that right. Okay, so if you choose home or work, that really puts you in the private network location awareness setting. Well, what in the world then is domain? This is anytime you've been properly authenticated, I'll just put authenticated, by a DC, domain controller. Okay, so if through that network connection I have been authenticated by a domain controller, then it puts me in the domain network location awareness, and there's no way for me to modify this. The computer will do this, or the operating system will do this without any intervention on my part. Okay. So this is where this is confusing to me because Microsoft kind of changes the terms and they pigeonhole us into different things than we would have thought we would have been put into. Let's go ahead and take a look at it this another way here as well. And I'm kind of going to go here and look at Network and Sharing Center again. And as we go into this, let's see what we've got here. Here I've got a domain network, okay? And why does it say that? Because I am a member of a domain, and through this network connection, I was authenticated by my domain controller through my local area connection here. But wait a minute, what's this? This says public network. Local area connection 2 and local area connection 3, and what in the world are those? If I go to manage my network connections, then I'll see that 2 and 3, if you look at them, are VMware virtual network adapters. And then since they did not authenticate against my domain controller, it automatically kind of backs off to a more precautious scenario where it puts me in the public network. Well, you might look at that and say, okay, fine. So why do I really care? Does it really matter? Does it make any difference at all? Well, if we go back to Windows Firewall, look what we see here. The Windows Firewall is on. Okay. Network location, though, is public network. Why is that? Because if there's any public network connections, then it defaults all of Windows Firewall back to the public network. And this could prevent me from being able to access resources or being allowed to allow other people on the network to access my resources properly, because it assumes I'm in a more locked down situation than I really am. And when I go back into my Windows Firewall settings here as well, take a look at what goes on here. It doesn't really show us in the interface, but if we go here to the exceptions again, and we pick and choose different exceptions, these all actually relate to whatever the network connection is at the time I configure these settings. So if I were to select network discovery right here, guess what? That doesn't configure me in my corporation, even though I'm not on a public network per se, even though I'm on my, authenticated by my domain controller and all of that. If I select network discovery, that turns it on for the public network. I could inadvertently then allow people to browse my resources while I'm on the Wi-Fi at the airport or something like that. So this is an important thing to be aware of. Now, how would I resolve that issue? Well, what I could do is go to manage my network connections, and then I don't really need these. In fact, I'm not really using these at all, so I'll just disable both of these. With the user account control, we'll see that this will then happen. And then once they're both disabled, look immediately what happens. I'll close this up. And back here, you saw it just blink off, in fact. Now I am immediately back to my domain network. And we see that, in fact, it even popped up Windows Defender for me here. And that appeared because of a system change. Now look what happens. I go back to Windows Firewall. Now it goes to domain network. I didn't even refresh the screen or anything. I just left it open. And now we see that we're on the domain network. Now when I change settings, any of the settings that I make here for my exceptions and all of that will apply to the domain network. So that is actually one of the disadvantages for using Control Panel Windows Firewall, because I am not able to configure all three different network locations in one interface. I have to change what network I'm on and then fiddle around with this kind of stuff. So it can be a little confusing, and you can kind of tie yourself in a knot there unintentionally. And besides the firewall settings, by the way, I think I might have alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I'll clarify this. If we get somehow pigeonholed into a public setting here, then that is going to prevent us from being able to do a number of different things on the network that we might actually want in a corporation or in a private network, such as network browsing, network discovery, and file sharing. All three of those things are not going to be available to us until we go back to the domain or the private network location awareness. Now then, if we want to go ahead and use another method for configuring the firewall, and we want to get to some more detail and a little bit more higher level configuration, you can do that using a tool that we looked at earlier in the previous nugget, which was the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. And we looked at this for IPsec previously, but now we're going to look at it for the firewall settings. So we can go to its inbound rules, which is where you're probably going to be configuring most of the settings here. And then you can create a new rule if you want to, and it'll start a little wizard for you, and you can just say, I want it to be a port or a program. I'll just do a port. This is really even more detail than we need to have for our current exam, but I'll just show you the kinds of things you can do here. I could say it's going to apply to TCP and all ports, or a specific port, maybe port 23 for my telnet traffic, for example. And I could say allow the connection, or allow the connection if it's secure, and then I can even require the connection to be encrypted, which might be a good idea for telnet, because normally that is passed in the clear, and I might have sensitive information that goes across the wire there. So then I can click on next, and then I can say only allow connections from these computers, and then you've seen this kind of an interface before, but I'll just find a few computers here, and I'll say I'll allow one of these systems here. If I can browse down, like that one. I'll allow that computer to connect, and only connections from specific users. I could use a similar method there to locate the users that I want to be able to connect. And then here's where I could say, this is one of those things where I said previously in the previous interface I showed us in Control Panel, you can only configure the firewall settings for whatever your current active profile is, your network profile is. Now I can select and pick and choose whichever ones I want those to apply. Then we click on next, and you name it, and you finish. And that's pretty much it. I'm just going to cancel. Otherwise, if you have settings that are already pre-configured in this, you can also look at these things as well. For example, remote desktop, for example. I think it's in here somewhere. There it is. Remote desktop, I could go into this setting. You can see here, as I mentioned earlier, it connects over TCP port 3389. But notice also, just as the message up here says, some of the predefined rules cannot be modified. So just be aware of that item. And items will be grayed out that you're not able to change. Now, all we see here as well is that we can choose to allow the connections. We can also choose allow only secure connections. And we can then require encryption in addition to that, or override any block rules. So if there's normally a rule that blocks the ability to connect over TCP 3389 for a remote desktop, well, this particular rule would then override that with this checkbox that we see here. Okay. Then we also, once we've chosen to only allow secure connections, we then have to choose the Users and Computer tab and choose who it is that we want to allow to connect. So we'd have to choose computers here, have to choose users down here, okay, in order to be able to make that work. All right, then on our programs and services item, you can just specify if there's a service associated with it, and then you can go to settings and identify which service it is. Again, this one you can't change because it's a predefined rule, so there's not that much to that one. On advanced, this is where the good stuff happens, because remember, right now it's only going to apply to these profiles, the public one. I can also choose to apply it to the public and private one if I wanted to, or just all profiles, which would be pretty much tantamount to selecting all of those. I can select what kind of connection types we want to make with this as well, whether it's RAS, wireless, or just a normal network connection. And we can also allow edge traversal, which allows it to bypass NAT routers, which are used to obscure our IP address inside of a network from the public internet. And as we keep on going, we can again specify any IP addresses. We kind of looked at this, kind of the same idea for IPsec that we looked at in the previous nugget, where we can identify a scope of IP addresses and so forth, and then our protocols and ports. Once again, since it's pre-configured, we're not able to change any of these things, but if we created it from scratch, you can choose TCP or UDP or any of the other protocols, for example, and then you can specify which port you want here as well. So this gives you an idea for configuring Windows Firewall with advanced security. Now, here's another thing to keep in mind with this as well. That is that in previous versions of the firewall, like the XP one, we really only had inbound rules that you could configure. With Windows Firewall with Advanced Security and Vista, you can now also configure outbound rules, and they really configure pretty much the same way, so that you can configure both types of settings. And there's not really an interface up in front of me right now to show this, but I'll just point this out to you so that you know. With the Windows Firewall in the control panel, what you have there is a setting that will allow you to have a pop-up that appears if a program tries to access the computer. And if you choose to allow that to take place, then what happens is it makes an exception for that program. And we kind of saw that a little bit earlier. But what I want to point out with that is it only allows that port or whatever it is to open up during the time you're using that actual program. If you create a new rule here and you customize this whole thing together and you create some kind of a port and so forth, and you manually create this not associated with an application, but just open up a specific port, for example, then it's going to be open 24/7. And for as long as it's turned on here, then it's going to always be open, and it will not shut down and close the way an exception would be, as it's made through a program exception. Now then, having closed that interface, let's take a look at another one. Here, if we go to some kind of a policy, again, this can be a local policy or a group policy if you want to apply this in an Active Directory environment. I'm just going to show you the local one here because the interface, once again, is exactly the same. It all looks the same. It just depends on where it's going to apply, whether it's in an organizational unit for Active Directory or locally, as I'm doing here with gpedit.msc. And we've seen this before. Now, as I get into this, we see a few different things we can work with. The main thing that I want to show you here is the administrative templates, network. Then we go down here to network connections, and Windows Firewall. Here we then see a domain profile and a standard profile. What's the difference between these, by the way? Because they look pretty much the same. The domain profile is anything that we configure or anything that will apply here now while we're connected to our network. The standard profile applies when we are disconnected from our network. Okay, so maybe if I'm on a Wi-Fi at the airport or something like that. But for our domain profile, you can see here that we can then set up different kinds of logging and so forth as well. And although this goes probably beyond our scope for the current exam, I want a couple of different things that might be of interest to us here. One is if I did this on a Active Directory group policy object, then with one click I could turn on the firewall for all of my clients. For, some people have turned it off because, hey, they weren't able to play the internet games they wanted and stuff like that. Well, I could override that by choosing this option, and if I double click on that and choose Enabled, basically what this is saying is turn on Windows Firewall on all computers. That's really what that's saying. Then if I didn't want users to make exceptions, maybe if they're local administrators especially able to configure that, then I could say do not allow exceptions, and then I would custom configure all the exceptions that they might need myself, and I would do it through this interface, and I'm again under Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Windows Firewall, Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, and the inbound rules. Now, it doesn't look exactly the same as the interface we saw earlier because on that computer there were already configured policies there, configured rules. Here we would configure a new rule, and anything we configure here for an Active Directory group policy object would then apply to all of the hosts that were subject to that policy. So in short, the group policy object is going to be the most efficient way to configure your firewall settings on an enterprise-wide basis. In this nugget, we took a look at Windows Firewall, which is really a very good firewall for one that's just included with the operating system and pretty full-featured. We saw that. It does block inbound traffic, and you can make exceptions to that or make allow rules as you like. We also saw that there are three basic interfaces to configure the Windows Firewall. There's Control Panel, which we looked at first, and it's the simplest way to configure this, but it only works on a local system, and so it's not really good for an enterprise-wide configuration. There's Windows Firewall with Advanced Security if you want to get more particular about the individual settings or have a little bit more control. And then you can also have the same level of control with a group policy object, except that with this it's going to apply the setting to whoever is underneath that scope of management for that policy. Now I showed you how to do that using the local group policy, the local policy editor, but the interface is exactly the same if you do it for a domain or whatever. One thing I don't really have on here because it's not part of our exam, but just so you know that you can do it this way, if you like a command line, you can also use the net shell command or net sh to configure this as well. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.